Welcome to the studio and welcome to Insiders, Senator.
G'day, Annabelle.
Now, in your speech at this weekend's Greens conference in Adelaide, from which you've just returned, you spent a fair bit of time of your opening address bagging the Labor Party. Is that the best approach if you want to get results in the Senate together?
Well, actually, the substance of my speech was talking about the shocking record of the Liberal Party and the fact that the Labor Party decided that the best way to beat a terrible Conservative government is by adopting their policies. I mean, what we need is a real opposition in this country, and it's very clear that the Greens are now the real opposition. It was the Labor Party who, quite rightly in the lead up to the election, talked about how important it was to improve the tax system to deal with economic inequality. You had the Deputy Leader saying that it was a good thing that coal was coming to an end. After the election, they've backed in the biggest tax cuts that we've seen. They've backed in the government's flat tax, small government agenda. Richard Marles is out there saying that we should celebrate the coal industry. You don't beat the Conservatives by adopting their policies. You don't say one thing before an election and another thing after an election. You stand up and fight for the things that you believe in. And that's what we want the Labor Party to do. That's what the Greens are doing. And that's why we are now the real opposition in the Australian Parliament.
So in this new Senate, do you think the most likely source of influence for you is actually going to be cutting deals with the coalition, as you've done before, rather than teaming up with Labor on things? Oh,
no, look, I think we'll work across party lines. It's very clear that we have very little in common with this coalition and their agenda. We were the only party in the Parliament to stand against those shocking tax cuts that turn their back on 100 years of support for progressive taxation, as the Labor Party has previously done.
Sure, but you've cut deals with the coalition in the past. Are you saying you wouldn't do that again?
Well, obviously you decide each thing on their merits, but the reality is this is a government stacked with climate deniers. They still continue this neoliberal trickle-down economics approach. So the reality is we'll work with all people across the party divide, but we'll also do what we've done, and that is work outside the Parliament, campaign on issues, as we have with marriage equality and the Banking Royal Commission, where it was our work outside the Parliament as well as in the Parliament that helped to address some of those significant reforms.
OK, well, let's have a look at a few things that the government's bowling up next week. There's this drought relief legislation where there seems to be a disconnect between the government and the opposition, not on the quantum of money to be spent, but on the technical arrangements of how they spend that money and the mechanism. Where do you stand on the government's proposed legislation to establish this $5 billion drought fund?
Well, we share the Labor Party's concerns. Our concern is that what you're doing is giving $100 million to the National Party so they can funnel money to their big corporate irrigator mates. They've made a mess of the Murray-Darling, and this law basically puts absolute power in the hands of the Water Minister so that they can funnel money into a whole range of their pet projects. We don't have any confidence that it's going to do anything to address drought in this country. And of course, I've got to make the obvious point. If you're really serious about addressing drought in Australia, then you have to deal with climate change, and you don't fix what is going to be a long-term problem of more severe, more frequent droughts unless you tackle the central cause, and that is the breakdown of our climate.
But on this drought funding, you'd rather stop that $100 million a year in the name of purity of the funding than extend that relief to farmers? Well,
we don't want to give the Water Minister an opportunity to funnel money that's going to do nothing to improve drought. And we've seen what happens when you do that, when you give a blank cheque. We've seen the disaster that is the Murray-Darling Basin. We'll look at amendments that subject any funding to an independent process so it goes to where it needs to go.
OK, what about this legislation that Scott Morrison in Dubbo said that he was keen to have passed urgently in the next 2 weeks, which is the bill to escalate punishments for animal rights activists like the Aussie Farm website operators who publish addresses and details of Australian farms and post photographs of their treatment of animals. Do you think that that should be a serious criminal offence?
It already is, Annabelle. We already have crimes. Trespass is a crime. Theft and damage of property is a crime. Those things are already criminal offences. The concern here is we've seen this government take us closer to a police state with the passage of a range of laws that hand over more power to authorities with a whole range of unintended consequences. There's a prospect that these laws could be used to criminalise protests, for example, coal seam gas activists, many of them farmers actually, protests against new coal mines, again farmers. the journalists may be caught up in this because they're going to have to prove that what they're reporting is doing is in the public interest. People hosting websites or indeed posting Facebook events subject to extreme criminal penalties. The substance of what we're actually talking about is animal welfare standards. And what we should be doing is debating laws about how we improve animal welfare standards so that we haven't got chickens in cages, battery hens, that spend their whole life without being able to spread their wings, or pigs in sow stalls that simply can't move while they're pregnant. I mean, they're the sort of things that we should be debating in the Parliament.
Sure. The people behind the Aussie Farms website and the film Dominion are very influential pro-animal rights activists in Australia. Do you approve of the work that they do?
Oh, I think it's really important to continue to raise awareness of the deplorable state of animal welfare in Australia. Most farmers do the right thing, but animal welfare standards need to be improved. When you're talking about people who, for example, might trespass on private property, then of course they have to face the consequences of those actions. But there are already laws that do that.
Sure, but do you think it's the right thing for them to do, and then where do you think the work they do is valuable, and do you approve of that work?
I think some of the work they do is absolutely very valuable. I think any films that raise awareness of animal welfare standards is very important. But there's no question that when you're talking about people trespassing on private property, then sometimes those things are a step too far. But there are laws that deal with that. They exist already.
So
we don't need new laws to do it.
all trespass on private property is a step too far? I mean, are there circumstances where it is the right thing to do to break civil laws?
Well, we're a party that has a strong and proud tradition of civil disobedience. Indeed.
Yeah, you've never been to prison,
I'm the only
but
leader of the Greens that hasn't actually been arrested yet. So it's not. I think when there are bad laws, civil disobedience is an appropriate response. But you need to face the consequences of that, and there are laws that allow us to do it.
Okay, so your party is full of activists and leaders like Bob Brown and Christine Milne have spent some time inside. Speaking of Bob Brown, he's emerging as a powerful opponent of the proposed Robbins Island wind farm in Tasmania. Is it a bit awkward to have a moment of agreement between a Greens legend and Tony Abbott, who this week described the windmills, the wind farms, as the dark satanic mills of the modern age?
No, I see that Rupert Murdoch's attack dogs are whipping himself up into a lather over this. The reality is that the Greens are very strong supporters of renewable energy. We understand that coal is the central problem when it comes to climate change, that we have to transition away from coal to renewable energy. Under Bob, we had a big hand in establishing the Clean Energy Finance Corporation that has meant billions of dollars flowing into wind projects and solar projects, but even our strongest supporters of those projects wouldn't say that every single site in the country is a suitable site. You wouldn't put offshore wind farms on the Great Barrier Reef or solar panels on the Opera House. You have planning laws, you have an appropriate planning system, you assess each proposal on their merits. This proposal, as far as I can tell, we don't know what the final number of wind farms are, we don't know exactly where they're going to be, we don't know the size of the farms. So it's going to be subject to a detailed planning process. We need stronger environmental laws, but it'll be assessed for their environmental impact, and then a decision will be made. So
you don't have an opinion on the Robbins Island wind farm proposal?
Well, we don't know what the proposal is yet. We haven't seen the final proposal. So when there is a final proposal, it will be subject to a whole range of planning laws. I'll tell you what I've got an opinion on. We need to transition as quickly as we can from coal-fired power, which is the central, biggest reason we have the breakdown of our climate, and we've got to transition to renewable energy as quickly as we can. And there are so many people who would welcome the establishment of large-scale renewable projects right across regional Australia because they create jobs, they create investment, and they know that this is the long-term future for this country. It means jobs for their kids and their grandkids, not short-term polluting jobs, long-term sustainable jobs.
The Robbins Island project is driven by what Dr Brown describes as the profit-seeking multinational UPC renewables. Is it a sign of renewable energy's success that it's now embraced by corporations big and profitable enough to offend the Greens?
Well, no, the substance of Bob's criticism is the impact on the local environment. This is an area where you've got migratory bird species, many of them threatened, nesting shorebirds, and that's why it needs to be subject to a thorough planning process.
Right, just quickly on your colleague Nick McKim, who's now regained his liberty. The PNG authorities say that he demanded admittance to the Manus facility and didn't make the appropriate arrangements beforehand. Are you satisfied with his conduct?
Absolutely. Nick indeed requested access to the facility. He didn't hear from, and he did that appropriately and through the right channels. Look, what's gone on here is that somebody, a decent person representing the voices of millions of Australians, has sought to shine a spotlight on what are horrific human rights abuses being contributed in the name of the Australian government. This is a very dark chapter in this nation's history. It only endures because the Australian government prevents people like Nick, prevents journalists and human rights monitors from accessing these facilities and telling the true stories of innocent people who've been locked up for 6 years. And I've got to say, I spoke to Nick and congratulated him on behalf of millions of people for doing what our Australian government should be doing, and that is fighting hard to close down these centres and to return some dignity, some humanity and some compassion to those innocent people who have been locked up for committing no crime.
Richard Di Natale, we are out of time. Thanks for joining us and see you next week.
Thanks, Annabelle.